We've got a tremendous group of panelists here. I am going to dispense with introductions. All of the bios are in the program. I can just tell you that we have the public sector, the private sector, we have land planners, we have historic consultants and community advocates here with knowledge on a wide range of the topic. So we're going to get right to it. We're going to start. My name is Kim Morkway, by the way. I am with Spinnaker Real Estate Partners. We are a developer. I'm the chairman of the Downtown Special Services District as well here in Bridgeport. And so it's a great pleasure and honor to have such a distinguished group up with us this afternoon. And we're going to start first off with Todd Bryan, who's going to take us through the historic tax credit process.
Yep. Good afternoon, everybody. What I do is, in relation to this, is I'm a historic preservation consultant, but I do a lot of tax credit work. And what tax credits do is they are federal and state financial incentives for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. What that means is if your arts organization, for example, wants to go into an old mill or typically an old mill or some other historic building, and you own the building or you can work with the owner to use these credits, they are a huge help financially. Rehabilitation is defined as the process of returning a property to a state of utility through repair or alteration, which makes possible an efficient contemporary use while preserving those portions and features of the property which are significant to its historic architecture and cultural value. In other words, it still has to look like it has to look more or less like it does. It has to, if it's a mill, it has to still feel like a mill. It doesn't have to be a museum. You can make massive changes to it. You can see this is an interior, and this is the proposed floor plan for that same interior. These buildings, to be qualified, they have to be listed on either the state and or national register of historic places. And what that means is if it's a national register listing, or actually any of them, both use the same set of criteria, slight variations. They have to be connected to a historical event, an important person, have to have architectural significance, or they must be important for archaeology, and they must have a high degree of integrity. This is the Lockwood Mathews Mansion. It's in Norwalk. It's a National Historic Landmark. You don't get more integrity than this place if you've ever been there. Yeah. Okay. This is an example of a building that is in the National Register of Historic Places. So you see, it does not have to be a place where George Washington slept, or anything even, nor does it have to be a monument like Lockwood Mathews. It can be a simple mill like this, but it has to have integrity. That's the important part. This looks pretty much like it did in 1952 when they closed up the Leroy Shirt Company. This is eligible only for the state register, which is a slightly lower bar. And the reason is it has a this is a school in Southington, but it's lost a lot of integrity. The windows have been changed, the interiors have been cut up, but it's still eligible for state register and therefore state tax credits. Federal income tax, it's 20% of the soft costs, or the hard and soft costs of construction. It's a straight federal income tax credit. There's a 5-year carry, 1-year carry back, and a 20-year carry forward. It cannot be used for nonprofits. And you have to spend at least the value of the building, less the value of the land. But it can be combined with a state program. Now keep this in mind. It's 20% of the hard and soft cost of construction. So if it's $1 million cost of construction, if you, or the building, the rehab is $1 million, you're going to come out with at least 200,000, maybe more, probably more, say 250,000 in straight credits. State credit, 25% of the hard costs only, has to be sold for cash, but the key for you guys is it can be used by nonprofits. Let's see, where else? It's capped at $4.5 million per project. It can be combined with the federal credit. Here's the other key. 20% plus 25% is a nominal 45% of the cost of rehabilitation. This is significant. And also the entire state program is capped at $37.1 million, and they hit it in 6 weeks this year. Both programs have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation in the rehab work, and site work is never included. And one thing that I should have added to this is that use of the property doesn't matter. So it can be anything. It can be a shared art gallery. It can be mixed-use space. It can be residential. It can be anything. It can be a doggy hotel. They don't care. I have to stand up to do this because I can't see the slides and I feel like a fool. Sorry. Besides, I'm a teacher. I like to stand up. So this is W. Brown Morton III is the guy that wrote these things. There are 10 standards. I don't want to go into the whole thing, but the idea is that there are a flexible group of 10 principles that are applied to the rehabilitation work. There can be some arm wrestling over exactly what works and what doesn't, but in the end, everybody usually comes to an agreement. And this is what they're based on, to identify the character-defining features of a building, that is something that makes a building what it is, retain what you can, preserve the integrity, and what I don't have up here is replace in kind if you can't fix it. Simple stuff. The best approaches to all of this is to fit the program to the building rather than the other way around. An architect will tell you that you have to design a building to fit the program, but in this case, the building already exists. So that means that when you look at the building, you want to make sure that that existing structure and most of the interior is going to be able to accommodate what you want to do. So you don't want to put a 20,000 square foot gallery in a building that's only got enough space for a 5,000 square foot open room or something like it. That might be a bad analogy for you, but you see what I'm saying. You have to analyze the building in light of the way you're going to use it. Early consultation with the SHPO. The SHPO is the State Historic Preservation Office. And this program is administered by the National Park Service and the Internal Revenue Service. But the filter for all of that is the State Historic Preservation Office. So the earlier you get them involved in the conversation, the better everyone's life will be. And believe me, this is probably the most important thing up here. And then you also include, when you do the pro formas and you figure out what you think this is going to cost, make sure you include both the expenses and the credits in your budget from the beginning. And all of these pictures, by the way, are real projects that I've been involved in. These are the real things that make this program worthwhile. It makes marginal projects feasible. So if you look at a project and you come up with a huge funding gap, this very often can fill it. You have to jump through some hoops, but the chances are it's worth it. And the state credit can be used by nonprofits, very important. You might not be able to use the full federal credit, the 20% of hard and soft, but you could certainly use the 25% of the hard costs. The things that kind of work against it a little bit, it's extremely detailed. It's very time-consuming. And it must be the right building. That's what I'm saying. The program has to fit the building. But the moral of the story is that this process does work. I have 6 of these going on right now. I've finished 5 more, and I haven't been doing this for that long. It works. They're in process. People call me every day for more of these things. It's not impossible, and it does work, but it's not easy. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Todd. And I should have mentioned that the program's focus is policies, incentives, around commercial space for cultural use. So next up is David Genovese, who has a great case study on Wilson Avenue, artist Lofts.
Thank you. I wish I had met Todd before I did this project in Norwalk. It might have been a little bit easier. But the story I'm going to tell you is about the Wilson Avenue Loft Artists, which is a group that we helped house. We'd acquired, I was in investment banking before, and I started this real estate company, Baywater Properties, in 2001. I moved back out to Connecticut where I'd grown up, and my first acquisition was an industrial park in South Norwalk at the intersection of Martin Luther King and Wilson Avenue. And it's 130,000 square foot complex of 6 buildings. One of the buildings was originally a Saccone oil terminal. The rail spur pulled right up to it, and they used to use it for transferring oil. And the person we bought the property from had an office on the 2nd floor and a small space in the corner. But there was this large space, and I think we have okay, there's the picture. There was a larger space, and this is about 4,000, 5,000 square feet, that had cool bones. It had oak columns and oak beams and exposed brick walls. The windows were old and leaky and single pane. And we had the idea when we bought the property that this was tough space to lease, but with the right vision, with the right tenant, we might be able to find an architectural firm or a marketing firm, someone that might want just cheap or cool space. By the way, it's kind of funny, and Kim would probably agree, 14, 15 years ago when we started working on this, the demand for exposed brick walls was not that great. And today it's all everybody wants. They'll take a Class A office building in Stamford and ask you to install brick on the walls to make it look cool and creative. But we tried to lease the space, and candidly, we struggled. We kept coming upon these people that just wanted cheap space. I mean, the Dish Network service technicians almost rented it, and flaky tenant after flaky tenant. Not that Dish was flaky, but just not the use we had in mind. People that just wanted cheap space, and I struggled because we had to invest a lot of money to create the space. We had to create an elevator to ensure ADA compliance. We had to create another stairwell. So we spent like $60,000 or $70,000, $80,000 just getting the space ready to be leased, not counting what we ended up doing on the inside. And one day, I was reading the local paper, and I read about the Loft Artists being displaced by the original developer of the South End in Stamford, Antares. And the article was going on about how the Loft Artists were to be displaced, and they had nowhere to go. And one of my neighbors in Darien was in the Loft Artists for many years. And when I lived in New York, I used to come out and go check it out when they'd have their open studios. And so I knew about them, and I reached out to my neighbor, and I said, listen, I have this idea for a place you might find interesting, but you're going to have vision. You're going to come look, but I'm warning you, it's kind of nasty in there. So you're going to have vision. And she said, well, I'm an artist, so I assure you, I have vision. I can see these things too. So we got together, and they loved the idea. And we basically came up with the idea of building out 12 artist studios and a gallery on the 2nd floor of the space, which, as I said, would have otherwise been relatively unleasable. So they got excited. As a real estate developer and owner, I didn't really want to rent to 25 different artists, and so I encouraged them to form a cooperative of sorts. And so they organized an LLC and put in place like a little organizational structure, and then they basically created licenses for use. And so I have one tenant. I agreed to pay for all the costs of building out the studios. Maybe we've got them now. Yeah, this shows you what we did. These are the individual studios with the doors closed, but you can see, the ceilings, and we put these cool industrial lights in, and the center, there's like a center hall with a gallery now, and then each of the artists has his or her own, mostly her, artist studios they're probably 20 foot by 20 foot, something like that. Some are bigger. But it has become this incredibly vibrant place where now They're loving this community that they've created, and there's a waiting list for the studios, so we get calls all the time to do more of this. I haven't really found the right space, and also this was expensive. We spent on the order of $200,000 to build out the studios, not counting the elevator and the stairwell. I could have used some historic tax credits.
I'm here to help.
I know. Is it too late? It's too late. It's too late now. That's okay. We'll find the next one. But it was a great experience. But the interesting thing about it, and I think maybe the reason Kim and David asked me to join, was that when we came up with the idea, when we realized how much it was actually going to cost, we concluded that we could do this. We were willing to do it and spend the money, even though it might have seemed a little crazy. However, we didn't want to do it in a way that would be put that money at risk, because the zoning regulations in Norwalk actually did not provide for artist studios anywhere in the industrial zones. So we had to consult with a lawyer, so we went and talked with our lawyer and said, look, we have this great idea, we really want to do this, but if we're going to spend another $200,000 or $300,000, we have to be assured that the zoning board won't come and just kick these folks out. And we're willing to make the investment, but we have to make it work. And so we actually did a text amendment and worked that through the process in Norwalk, and the city was phenomenal. They were excited about this. They were excited because in the past, artists were really just squatting in places that were not rentable while developers or property owners waited for a higher and better use. And so anyway, the story ends well. It's almost 8 years now that the Wilson Avenue Loft artists have been in place. And I'd encourage you to Google them. They have a website with all the artists' work on display, and they have open studios twice a year. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, David. Great story, and that's a great, actually, lead-in to our next panelist, Erin Wilson, who's the Director of Economic Development for the City of Torrington, and I think she has some experience with the zoning department as well.
Yes, thank you. For those of you who don't know, Torrington is the north end of Route 8. We're not the last town, but we're just short of Winstead. City of Torrington and within Litchfield County, we're trying to create an environment that does support the artists. We have a lot of old industrial brownfield sites within our downtown, and we also have an ample amount of affordable housing. So we, as a city, we've been focused on promoting live workspace and just providing an environment that really does support artists and what they do. So it wasn't until 2014, when I first started in Torrington, that we were approached by this gentleman on the board here, artist Ed Jaffe, who was drawn to Torrington because we have a lot of Art Deco buildings downtown. He was wanting to retire. He was looking for a rural community. He's a sculpturist, and he came to Torrington and fell in love and immediately walked into the mayor's office and said, your zoning regulations don't work for us. And he's like, I'd love to sell Torrington. I'd love to promote Torrington to all my artist friends, but your residential zoning regs really don't work. Downtown district, we have a downtown district in Torrington that pretty much eliminates all zoning regulations or requirements if it's a mixed-use development. And so from a live-work perspective, if an artist wanted to move into our downtown, and as long as they provided some form of a gallery space, they were welcome within our downtown. But residentially, the only way an artist could perform or work within their home is if they met our home occupation standards, which at the time was about only 25% of your living floor area or 500 square feet, whichever was less, within the dwelling itself. So when Ed Jaffe showed up, he is a sculpturist, and 500 square feet just wasn't going to work for him. And he bought a property that had this wonderful old farm outbuilding. And he was convinced that that's where he should do his work, and he brought electricity out there, but the regulations didn't work. So this 87-year-old artist started to, on his own, went to all of our city boards and said, look, we need to change the zoning to allow artists as a live workspace within their homes and to work in structures outside within the dwelling. So he was able to do that. He went before Arts and Culture, he went before the EDC, and he went before the Planning and Zoning. And his concept was to make it possible for an artist to purchase a home or a commercial property anywhere in Torrington to be able to live and work in that property and not be overly restricted as to how they can use their spaces. So now that that's happened, he did not stop. And he said, you know what, this is great that we have this awesome zoning. Not a lot of towns offer this. Let's now start promoting it. So he's calling this his art blanket, and he created the Artist Relocation Program. And this is just a snapshot of a website that's now on our city website. And basically, it's just an opportunity for us to market Torrington outside of Torrington and Litchfield County. I am economic development, so I don't work directly with this program. Our city planner does. And to be honest, just a short period of time, and the program was launched this past year, we've had at least 6 or 7 different artists approach the city, looking at places where they can move, relocate. They're falling in love with our downtown. And it's just been a great thing for us. And so I will say that one of the things that Mr. Jaffe did, and kind of drawing upon some of the conversation today, was he started off saying, look, I can do this. I'm 87 years old, and I'm willing to promote this program. I'm really willing to create this art blanket. But at the end of the day, the city really needs to get involved, and the city really needs to help promote this program. And he made it happen in the city, and now because of his efforts and because we were educated on what the artists really need, now we're able to provide a place for them to live, work, and play in the city of Torrington.
Terrific. Wonderful story. Our next panelist is Robert Orr, architect and urban planner from New Haven, and has a long history working with new urbanism and has been a leader in that interesting field. Robert?
Thanks, Kim, and thank you for inviting me here. I wanted to just start with a couple of clarifications. The high cost of free parking, what that means is that if you have parking, the person that owns the property doesn't pay tax. And that means somebody else has to pay that tax. So it really is you're just transferring your free parking to somebody that lives in Bridgeport that has to pay for your parking. Number two, parking has an incredible boost to retail on a vibrant retail street. If it's a dead retail street, it doesn't produce much. But on a good retail street, parking, if you limit it to half an hour, brings in about $250,000 per store. So knowing how to manage your parking is very important. Anyway, I'm talking about space. So I wanted to start out and say that space, well, first of all, I've heard a lot about space inside buildings today. But the people who originated the term, the new urbanists, about 30 years ago, were talking about space outside, so that they see that buildings form space, ideally, and not to go into a long history of that. But the slide that was just up, I wanted to just show the different kinds of space. There's public space, there's private space, there's agricultural space, all different kinds of space. Okay, next. These are 3 slides that are space-making slides. Notice they're all outside of buildings. The top one is what we call a bottom-up transformation. This is Hanover Street in north end of Boston that was basically upgraded from a blighted street to what you're looking at by a young, kind of vibrant population that moved in and wanted to make a better place for themselves. The bottom 2 are new urbanist creations that were sort of top-down, if you will, created from scratch. Next. What I wanted the headline of my talk is the headwinds of creating space, and the biggest one is zoning that we just heard in the previous presentation. These 2 maps show for the same location what it is allowed by zoning in the top one, and what, if you change the code, you would be allowed to do. So you can see clearly that most every lot in the city and in most cities don't permit development of any kind. So that if you have and it does require parking and wants free parking. So cities are more or less shooting themselves in the foot. Next. This is a slide I sort of put together that that a lot of people don't think about, thinking about secondary effects. I mean, we all love that federal government provides this and that and the other thing, but nobody stops to think about what does all that cost and who pays for it. And there has been a steady growth of federalism in this country for 60 years. And at this point, regulations are so huge that an average project, say a small project, the regulations alone add $40,000 to $80,000 in the construction cost of that project. So that's who's paying for it. Wait a minute. So that the red tape at the top, trying to do anything with it, not only does it cost more, but it takes more time. You'll find, and I think a lot of people up here will agree, that it takes years to get a project approved and through the regulations to get to where you can build it. And this explains also why rents are so high in these buildings. It has to pay for all this red tape, including parking. You are only allowed to charge, if you can charge your tenants for parking, $150 per space. And that's 300 square feet, which is kind of a mini loft where you could be getting $1,000 to $1,200 a space. So it's obvious that the parking is not paying for itself, and so every unit has to pay for the parking. Oh, the other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, the zoning code doesn't permit the bottom picture. This infill building is completely illegal. If you were allow these buildings, then very small developers could get involved. People that are wanting to spend $100,000, not $1 million, or maybe $400,000, maybe in the case of this building. So it's much more inclusive. You have developers who are in the community doing this. They have skin in the game, as it were. They want to make their community better. They want to keep the money in the community, and they can afford to do it. And local banks, not national banks, are happy to underwrite these projects. Next. Trying to battle these headwinds has been an uphill battle. And as Kim mentioned, one of the avenues. By the way, new urbanists have been battling this for 35 years, and every year they discover something new what's a new impediment and what's a new way to get around that impediment. And a few years ago, they came up with this notion of tactical urbanism, which is basically coming in and just doing something. And on the left side are what are called sanction actions, which is to say it doesn't really hurt anybody and nobody can really take issue with it. This one down here is called chair bombing, where you just bring a whole lot of chairs and you set up eating areas on a street or in parking areas or whatever. And then the one on the lower right is unsanctioned tactical urbanism, where you actually come out in the darkness of night and paint lines for a pedestrian crosswalk. But in any case, the tactical urbanists, they demonstrate something and the city takes note, and sure enough, a lot of these projects turn into permanent projects. Next. We've talked about this a lot, so I won't dwell on it, but some of the ways that you can improve your city and get a lot of tax credits, et cetera, and grants, and there are a lot more that aren't even mentioned, is to tackle existing buildings in your community. Once again, buildings that people within the community can tackle and at much lower rates, and keep everything in the community. This is a building here that for 50 years or something, 40 years, was worth almost nothing, and it was improved, and it's now, read the numbers, worth quite a bit. And I don't have to tell you that the tax revenue on the left, if this were in New Haven, would be about $12,000. And I have 7 seconds? 14. Oh, okay. I think this is about it. Wait, let me see the next one. Oh, you can't see down here. So this is the last slide, which is, I don't know if you can see it, it's dark, but where you create an environment where people with no resources can get involved by replatting a large piece of property, in this case it's 100 acres, into very small parcels. We're talking 32 by 38 size parcels, where you can actually build a 4-story building and get 9 units into that building, these little mini lofts and a 1-bedroom on the top, so that on the 100 acres you can fit about 20,000 units. And in aggregate, they all work together, and they're affordable, and yet they bring in the same profits for a developer, or they can go on land sales. Anyway, I think that's what I had to say.
Good. Okay, thank you, Robert. Next up is Jackie Lightfield. Jackie has a very varied background and is the current chief problem solver at Norwalk 2.0 and a former zoning chair. And she gets to talk about incentives and policies. Jackie.
Great. As David mentioned about the Wilson Avenue Lofts, I was on the Zoning Commission. I don't think I was chair yet, but I'm going to kind of tweak my presentation a little bit to get away from talking about what we can do from incentives and policies for developers and talk more about what artists can do to get policy changed and what kind of policy outcomes you can look at. So yes, having an artist on a zoning board makes zoning changes to enable creative uses or repurposes of buildings happen, but that's not always something that you can do. For all intents and purposes, policy, and I'll give you a little definition, is where developers and creatives collide with outdated rules that make it too difficult to activate cultural spaces. And there's a variety of ways that happen. I think most of the panelists have touched on most of them. Minimum parking requirements and environmental impact reports are two of the big things that an individual arts organization or artist will not have the capacity to tackle, and that needs to be changed on the policy side so that cultural uses do not have to provide those requirements. The idea of rezoning is a time-consuming and expensive process, and no developer is going to tackle that on their own. That needs to come from the community. That means all of you artists out there need to advocate for this, because change is difficult. Nobody really wants to change things, particularly things they don't understand, and the zoning code throughout the state is very convoluted. The principal purpose of zoning, as it was created many, many years ago, was to achieve one basic outcome, and that was to separate home, work, and industrial or manufacturing uses. That's what the zoning code attempts to do. So when we talk about trying to get live workspace in old factories that happen to be in industrial zones, you can see why that might be very difficult to accomplish in certain towns that have not revised their zoning. And it's great that Torrington has taken the lead to revise that. Other policy things that artists can consider end up on the funding side. So the city of Nashville decided that it wanted to have a vision about creating more of a cultural and artistic focused community. So they passed policy where they decided that they were going to, by ordinance, donate 1% of their operating fund to the administrative and organizational capacity of arts organizations. So that was an important move from a policy standpoint to provide funding for arts organizations or the administration and policy making of that arm. The other thing that they did is they mandated that 1% of any general obligation bond, which is usually the bonds that municipalities use to do capital improvements, they wanted 1% to go to fund the restoration or acquisition of public art. So with those two policy tweaks, they basically, from a municipal level, funded the capacity building for the arts community, and also a way to preserve and create and display art throughout their community. So that's one way to look at policy from a funding side. A lot of the panelists have talked about the tax credits for buildings, but not for people. And I do have some examples of policy that was put together in Somerville, Massachusetts to attempt to address that. So instead of thinking about tax credits for building rehabs, what about sales tax credits or exemptions for goods produced or sold within an arts district? Or what about income tax credits and exemptions for artists living and working within that district? Or tax waivers for events, either on the amusement or admission, which are revenue categories, within an arts district. And then lastly, to provide an eligibility for special loan funds at below market prices for arts activities that happen within a district. That presumes, of course, that there is something called an arts district. That's another policy example that artists can work on. Providence, Rhode Island created 10 designated arts districts throughout the city of Providence that each have many of these things in place. For example, the sales tax is waived on purchases from original artwork within the district, and the artists pay no state income tax on any income from their art. So that's another example of incentivizing the people, the artists that are making the work, as opposed to the buildings. The last thing I want to touch on is getting back to our friend zoning, that a lot of the zoning code is always about enforcement, right? It's always about noise, it's about parking, it's about crowding, it's about health codes and stuff like that, and so the regulations become very onerous in how that they're described, what they don't want to see happen, and then of course nothing really gets enforced until somebody complains about it. So we're at a time where we have technology that can provide municipalities that are a little afraid of changing their zoning to try things like low-cost sensors that can provide information on real time. So if there's a concern about whether adequate parking is in an urban area, you can censor a parking lot and actually know what the frequency of parking spaces are being used to kind of alleviate the concerns of zoning boards and so on, that there isn't really a problem. Or if a dance studio wants to open in a place and residents say, well, you know, they're going to be loud, they're going to make noise, you can actually have a sensor that can give real-time information of what the decibel levels and so on is. So as we look to the future of how policy can change, there are new tools in the toolbox, and artists need to get more involved. And hopefully at the end of this program, we move to the action steps of what we can do next together, collectively, at least to brainstorm and move some of these issues forward in a more positive way.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay, so we're, yes. So
Okay, go ahead.
we've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to exercise my, my discretion as a moderator to dispense with questions from the audience. We're going to direct a couple of questions up here amongst the panelists, and then afterwards there'll be plenty of time, I'm sure, to do a Q&A directly with our panelists and so forth. But I think that will be more productive since we only have 10 minutes left. And all our panelists have 1 minute on anything they say. Okay, this time I'm going to cut you off. Go.
Me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that it does not take months and years. Next week, if anybody wants to come, we're going to be redoing the code in Derby in 5 days. We spent some time with communities and interest group for a couple months before that, and it'll take us a month or two after that to get all written up. So, and probably 1,000 codes around the country have been done this way. So if you want to do that, you can do it.
Terrific. And for those of you who don't know the Congress of New Urbanism, the kind of main proponent was Anders Dwane, and he is very big on coming in and doing charrettes, getting the community together and trying to figure out, you know, a direction and so forth. So very interesting stuff. You know, cheaper, faster, lighter is part of the tactical urbanism model. I want to you know, I think we touched on it, and I think I heard it earlier today in the discussions and on the panels. There's a disconnect from what I can hear, you know, with the artistic community and the property owner community and probably the public sector as well. You know, and there needs to be a better dialogue. But I want to talk a little bit about the economics. So I'm going to direct a question to start with David about the economics on yours, because that was a commercial. You bought the building privately. It was a commercial venture, and so, you know, was there any other use for the building? Did you get any incentives from Norwalk at all, other than the zoning change? And you know, how did you figure that out?
So to be totally candid with you, we had bought the property. It was a brownfield site. It was really kind of messy property. We figured it out and financed it privately with commercial, traditional debt financing. And the space was, I'll call it throwaway space. I mean, luck, I think, plays, we all hate to admit it, but luck plays a role in many of these situations in that, you know, I tried to lease this space. I thought I had a good idea for a space that I could recreate for architects or marketing firms. None of them were interested. The market spoke. There was no interest. So my basis was, in my mind, once I crossed that bridge, zero. I hadn't really paid for the building, that part of the building. So I kind of talked myself into this idea. You've probably been there before too, where I said, okay, I could just sit here and pretend that I'm going to get $12 a foot or $10 a foot for this space as it exists today, but 3 years later that hasn't happened. So let's just say it has zero value, and I'm going to spend $300,000 on 4,000 feet, $90 a foot, roughly, something like that, to create something that has some value. The risk was, for me, that the artists failed. That we did this, we built it, in my mind, the risk was that they failed and they couldn't.
Okay, so
it wasn't a sustainable idea.
So if there wasn't really a market per se, and you kind of created it in artist space, but what's the cost of that if it's just vacant, empty, you own the building, your heating and lighting, what's the cost of that?
You mean just the operating costs?
On a per square
Probably
foot basis.
$3 to $4 a foot.
And did you provide other incentives other than the build out for artists?
No, I took
You
the
didn't.
risk on them and I built it out.
Right. How much did you spend per square foot?
Like $80, $90 a foot.
Okay.
And they're paying me about $10 a foot net.
A lot of money.
A lot of money. And you know, to be candid, my father, it's like that rug commercial I used to see, like, please don't tell my father I said I'd sell you the carpet for X. My dad thought I was crazy. He kept looking at me going, you know, how much are we spending on this?
Right.
And we stripped the floors. But, you know, we created something great. And I would say, looking back, of all the buildings we've built and things that we've done, it's one of those spaces I'm most proud of. So it was reasonable. It was a reasonable economic decision once we assumed zero value for the land and building. That's a big assumption.
Leap. Okay, I'm going to move to Erin and ask her if there's any examples from Torrington. And does Torrington offer any other incentives other than this zoning change that you talked about?
So the problem we have in Torrington is we don't have lucky developers like yourself that are willing to take these industrial sites and clean them themselves. Our market's not there. We're the largest micropolitan community in the country, which means we have a population less than 50,000, but we service a greater area of about 180,000 residents in Litchfield County. And so when a developer comes to even look in Torrington, they look at basic demographic data. We're also a distressed municipality. And so they look at Goshen and Litchfield and other towns around us and say, hey, we'd love to do some development there. Those small rural towns don't want them, so they don't come to us. So incentives for us right now is, besides having the affordable commercial space, the city has had to primarily focus our time and effort on brownfield redevelopment because, to the point you made before, artists really don't have the time, the ability to go after brownfield sites and clean them up. And so we've been utilizing a lot of the state incentive programs to start cleaning these properties so that we as a municipality can help flip them for redevelopment.
Jackie, your experience in Norwalk, what did you find on the economic side? Where was the tension?
So on the economic side, Norwalk is a kind of unique city in that it really has no downtown. So it has 6 essentially competing areas that want to function as a downtown, and so there's a lack of cohesion in coming up with a economic model that's going to work to build density in any one particular location. With Norwalk 2.0, we've worked throughout the city in different areas, activating vacant spaces and doing arts programming to attract clients. We've been very successful in the South Norwalk area, not so much in the Wall Street area, but without the city having a clear vision that it wants to do this and in putting policies in place to sustain it, what we're doing is a lot of one-off things. And I think that the development community also, and Kim, you can jump in here, or David, recognizes that they kind of wait for somebody to bring a project through before they decide whether they're going to be interested in it or not, instead of saying, well, this is what we want.
Right, and that can be a very slow, cumbersome process.
Very slow.
I wanted to just pivot and talk about one other thing quickly, and that is, I heard in the presentations, Erin, you mentioned Robert Jaffe, an individual that kind of jumped into the pool and saw an opportunity and had a passion and so forth. David, did you mentioned a woman that kind of took the lead because you had to form a co-op and all that stuff. So how important is the individual role here? And we're going to go right down the line, 15 seconds each. Okay? Yeah.
I think in our case, it was the luck of having the property where we kind of could cross that bridge and say, okay, we're starting from zero, no basis in this existing land. The artist who was in the Loft Artists, and my willingness to take the leap of faith.
Right.
Those three things, and then Norwalk, to the credit of the zoning commission in Norwalk, they quickly got it. I mean, so we had to spend money to create the text amendment. That was a pain, and do the traffic studies and so on, but they made it as easy as they possibly could have, I would honestly say.
Terrific.
So no gripes.
So, okay, Todd?
The individual is the most important part of the whole process. If you don't have somebody that's got the vision and the capacity to pull this off, or ideally a couple of people who have the vision and capacity to pull this off, it's clearly not going to happen, because as everybody here has said, it ain't the easiest thing in the world to do. It's real estate development with another layer of complication, but the individual is key.
Robert, any examples from New Haven or in your past work?
Not New Haven, but I would say that we worked a long time with developers, mostly in other parts of the country. And the thing that distinguished them is that they had intention and vision. And they would go out and find people to locate in certain locations. And we've done a lot of work recently in municipalities, and there isn't an equivalent of that. Everybody's just waiting for that project to come in. And I think that we did the smart code for Hamden about 7 years ago, and I think so far there's only been 6 or 7 buildings built. And I think that somebody has to become the benevolent dictator, as it were, in these towns to represent the town, but to have a vision and an intention on how, in other words, where development's going to start, what it's going to be like, where it's going to end, where the civic buildings are going to go, where the streets, how the streets are going to be done cheaply, et cetera.
Jackie, you and your work in Norwalk 2.0 and with Mary Beth. So other than you two being champions, what's your experience?
You know, the only reason that we're successful in what we do in Norwalk is because we had a community behind us, and that was the arts community that wanted to participate, wanted to help us clean up spaces, build places, and so that's been fantastic. But, you know, I don't want to forget my other city, which is Stamford, and the opportunities in Stamford is great because we're working on an innovation district that is going to include the arts and all things innovative within it. And that's a planning process that, you know, all cities should undertake. Master planning shouldn't just be about residential and commercial and industrial. It should be about cultural. So if your city does not have a cultural plan, and if it's not doing any master planning in that direction, it really should.
Terrific. And we're going to end on that. It's 4:30, and I have an announcement, but before that, I would like all of us to give our panelists a big round of applause. So this has been a terrific day. I want to thank the Cultural Alliance for organizing this and sponsoring it, as well as Phil Kuchma for providing the facility and being a sponsor. And also a special shout out to David Green. He did an extraordinary job putting this together in a very short amount of time. All of the programs and the panelists today have been excellent. We heard a lot of great content. And he asked me if I would contribute a few thoughts about next steps and so forth. So I've made some notes, and I'm going to reel them off very quickly. First of all, I'd propose that the Space Summit become an annual event and take place at this time during the Art Trail. So that's number one. We'd be happy to be a sponsor of it in the future because this has been such a terrific start. Number two, Jackie had wonderful examples and models about mechanisms to get consistent funding coming to the arts. We don't have that, and we need that. We need money. That's what's going to make it work. So I would suggest that we form a committee of some sort that will explore mechanisms for consistent funding to support the arts community. And then finally, I would like to propose that the Cultural Alliance convene the stakeholders and representatives of the stakeholders, and it's really government, it's the private sector with the property owners and developers, and the arts community to get together to talk about bridging these gaps in collaboration and working together. So that's a cap on the event. Thank you all. And now for the fun of it, you are all invited to a reception just around the corner at 1119 Main Street. You can walk there, it's only 2 blocks. Fairfield and then turn north, go up 1119 Main Street. It is a real-time case study. It's a project that my company just completed. 70 units. It's historic preservation, where we did use tax credits. We have ground floor commercial, which is both our biggest challenge and our biggest opportunity. And you can take a tour, and you can even rent an apartment if you're in the market, or a commercial space. So I invite you all there, and look forward to seeing you. Thank you.